Okay, good morning. All the outside studios have rained out, so I'm relegated to the inside today. Welcome, it's Sunday morning, and we're busy with our series on the early beliefs of the Jesus followers. And so we've been tracking a bit of information that helps us to understand what the earliest followers of Jesus might have believed. So this is session 3. And I want to do a very quick summary of session 1 and 2. Just take 5 minutes to just run through the basics. Okay, so the question we're trying to answer is, what did the earliest followers of Jesus believe? We're not talking about the time period in which the Gospels were written. We're not talking about the time period in which Paul wrote. We're talking about a time that's even before that, for which we really don't have any text or any writing, at least not surviving. So we're talking about the period that's directly after the death or the life of Jesus and before Paul wrote his earliest works, which some date as early as 48 AD. So we're basically looking at the time period between 33 AD and 48 AD, which is a time period we don't, like traditionally, we won't learn too much about. There's a lot of speculation. And so this is also just a method in trying to assess what these very earliest Christians might have believed, because scholars have realized that the Christian belief has shifted over time, and especially in the 1st and 2nd century up until the 4th century, it's still in its early phases of development. So it stands to reason that the very earliest followers of Jesus, those, basically we're really talking about almost the disciples, because once Jesus left them, they had to make sense of what had happened. So we're talking about a really, really early time period. The thing that we mentioned earlier on is there seems to be pre-literary creeds, creed-like material. In other words, something that was there before Paul would even write down his first letters, and they normally come in a creedal format. They seem to exist, and we seem to have traces of them within our writings of Paul, especially the early non-disputed writings of Paul, and that Paul chose to include these writings or these pre-literary pieces of material, which we discussed. And so we went on to last week, have a look at how do scholars actually identify pieces of material or portions of a letter as being pre-literate. In other words, pre-literary, which means that it existed before Paul wrote, and it is not necessarily something that Paul makes up as he is writing, but he is quoting something that other people might have known from a time earlier than his writing. 4 or 5 quick ways in which these pre-literary portions of Paul's letters could be identified. Number 1, they seem to be self-contained units. If you take them out, they make sense on their own. Secondly, they have a very strong literary structure, many times in a poetic or a creedal form, and they have a rhythm of their own. Thirdly, they contain unique words or phrases that the writer, in our case Paul, does not necessarily use at all anywhere in his writing. So that makes it very curious to us. Fourthly, they may even contain ideas and theological ideas that are different from the person who is using them. In other words, when Paul, in this case, quotes or uses a pre-literary poem or a creed of some nature, it might contain things that Paul later in his writings, then it doesn't seem like they believe exactly the same thing. It's one of the things that shows us that this portion actually doesn't belong to Paul. He got it from somewhere else. And as we'll see in many cases, it seems like Paul kind of updates the creeds to fit better, but in some cases he doesn't do that very effectively. Then lastly, number 5, is that even when you read, and you'll see after we deal with these creeds in Paul's writing, you'll get a feeling that, hey, this doesn't feel like it fits the prose that was written here. It feels like it's inserted. It's a very it's something that's quite obvious, and you would have noticed that just in your normal reading of Paul's letters. And we seek here to just give an explanation of what is actually going on. In other words, the letter could even make sense if you pulled out these little creedal pre-literary portions. Okay, so we moved on to Romans 1:3-4. which is the first one of three of these pre-literary portions that we're going to be dealing with. And this is possibly the oldest one for reasons we'll discuss a little bit later on. And so we had a look at Romans 3:4, and we found out that this pre-literary portion's got two stanzas like a poem, and each stanza or unit has got 3 lines inside. And these 3 lines of each one of them, they chronologically sit like this, but you could lift them up and put them next to each other because they correspond. And so that's how it's very apparent that they've got a structure. So in Romans 1:3-4, it's let me just read it to you quickly. He says, concerning his son, Jesus Christ our Lord, which was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection of the dead. And so in Romans 1:3-4, in this portion here, we kind of see 2 structures, 2 units that correspond. The one is about the natural side of Jesus. The other one is about the spiritual side, or not the spiritual side, the divinized sonship of Jesus. And so what we find in this little portion, number one, is it seems to be self-contained. It's like a little poem that you could pull out and just stick on your fridge or behind your toilet door. Number two, it has a very strong literary structure to it. And one of the most interesting things about this little portion is that it has very unique phrases. For instance, Jesus made flesh according to the seed of David is a phrase that you find nowhere else in Paul, which is very surprising. And in fact, if you look a little bit deeper, Paul never ever connects Jesus to David as Jesus being David's son in an explicit way. So it's not something Paul writes about, but yet we find it in this whole portion. And then secondly, the saying, the Spirit of holiness, is very interesting to scholars, firstly because it seems to be so old, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but also because Paul never ever uses this phrase again, the Spirit of holiness. It's only found in this little portion. And then lastly, which is actually the most important part and the most interesting part, and this is the part that gives us information about the earliest Christians and what they believed, is that it seems like in this little portion, if you read it plainly for what it says, that Jesus was born like a human. It doesn't recall a virgin birth, and just he comes by as a seed of David, according to the flesh. But then something happens. He becomes and is declared. The word declared here means to be appointed, to set into position as the Son of God, in fact, according to the Spirit of holiness. But it says, by the resurrection from the dead. And so this is also an idea that you were not going to find in the rest of Paul. Because simply Paul did not believe that Jesus became divine or the Son of God, some form of a divine sonship, by the resurrection from the dead. And when you read this little poem on its own, that's what it says, that the divine sonship or divinity was given to Jesus by his resurrection. It happened at the resurrection. So in other words, what the poem kind of propagates is an idea that Jesus was actually human. And that later he became divine, and specifically became divine when he was obedient until death. God then chose to make him his son, to give him a divine sonship, and as most Christians believe, has been taken up into heaven. So by the resurrection of the dead, this click over or the switch came into being. Now, Paul doesn't believe that. As far as we can see, early Paul tells us, gives us the idea that Paul believed that Jesus was in fact a pre-existent divine being. All right, so the point of all of this, of course, is to note that if this is a pre-literary source that Paul is using to connect to the Roman church, because he hasn't been there in his writing to them, he uses it very early on in his writing to find common ground, that this could in fact have been a creed that was in existence before Paul started writing. In other words, this could have been something people would have memorized, that they possibly would have gathered on a Sunday and said this together. And that's what makes it so curious, that it looks to us, it looks to scholars, that this portion actually means that they believe that Jesus became the Son of God only at the resurrection. All right, so as promised today, we're going to deal with that idea and break it up a little bit further, because it's actually incredibly important. As we mentioned earlier, it seems like Christianity's ideas about Jesus, specifically Jesus's identity, which is crucial and has always been the central part that Christians fight about, and that they did fight about up until the 4th century. Of course, after that as well, but the official record says that we settled it by the end of the 4th century, is Jesus's identity. And with that comes the idea of, was Jesus pre-existently divine? How was he born? Did he become divine during his life? Did he become divine at the resurrection? And then, of course, after that, now, how do we look at him and how do we see him? And that's where the idea of the Trinity, of course, comes out of these discussions and these tensions within the faith. And today we'll have a look at some of the tensions that can even be found within our own Gospels. Never noticed this. This is maybe a bit of new information, but the more you study this, the more it becomes apparent that even within the Gospels, there is a progression of the identity of Jesus. From the earliest to the latest Gospels, the 4 Gospels that we have, Mark to John, it seems like the later in time, the more highly the writers were esteeming Jesus. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what we're going to be speaking about today is this idea of, could it be that they believe that Jesus was, in fact, at his resurrection, he was adopted as the Son of God. He was normal human before this. But at the resurrection, he was adopted into his sonship. Others use the term, he was exalted into his sonship and his divinity. So this is the idea that many would call an adoptionist view or an adoptionist Christology. When we say Christology, we just mean how Christ is viewed, the theology of how Christ is viewed. So the adoptionist Christology is obviously a very interesting one, and I've been a pastor all my life, and this is the first time I come across it in the last 4 years of my more contextual study of the New Testament, and I've just absolutely been blown away by this idea, and I'm kind of convinced that this might have been the way that the very earliest church actually viewed Jesus. So God, let's, earliest followers, let me rather say that, actually view Jesus. So today I want to spend a bit of time on the idea of an adoptionist Christology, or otherwise called an exaltation Christology. That's what we're doing today, and then we'll come back to Romans 3-4 and conclude that this morning. So a quick side note on the idea that Jesus became the Son of God at his resurrection. Now, if you're a little bit worried, you look at me with strange eyes, yes, let me just clarify. This is not the Trinity. This is not what Catholics and Protestants believe about Jesus today. That's not the question we're answering. We're trying to answer the question of early followers of Jesus, like the earliest guys who never did any theology, who was never really influenced by Greek philosophy of the 2nd century and the church fathers like Justin Martyr, who was essentially a philosopher, I think in Rome, as far as I remember, that shaped the ideas about Jesus. We're talking about the fishermen. We're talking about people, peasants that are walking around. What are the ideas that were going around about Jesus before Paul writes, before the Gospels were written? They've got nothing to refer to except the stories, the oral traditions of who Jesus was, what he did, and how he should be seen. Okay, so this is all obviously, as I said, called an adoptionist or an exaltation view of Jesus. Thus, Jesus, according to this view, he is adopted or exalted to become the divine Son of God, in other words, divine, at the resurrection. But before this, he was completely and fully human. In other words, he was the promised Messiah that the scriptures promised, but he lived his life as a normal human. This would explain a lot of things, right? You've read those portions of the Gospels where you're like, if he's God, like, what's going on here? What's going on here? What's going on here? Many portions like this, especially in Mark, but even all the way through Matthew and Luke as well. So this idea says, no, he was actually kind of fully human all the way through. And at the resurrection, that was the first point of interest. That's actually where he became God or divine. Not God himself, but divine in the sense of God-like. And a term that would have been used for that would have been, he became the Son of God, appointed, adopted as the Son of God. Okay, so here in Romans 1:3-4, we can see quite clearly the idea that Jesus is exalted to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead. Even though this disagrees with Paul's general consensus from the rest of his letters, if this is pre-literary and Paul is just using it, it means that this could point back to a time where people actually could have believed this. The question, of course, always is this the only portion that we can refer to for something like this? And the answer is no, it actually isn't. In some of the the recorded speeches of Peter and Paul by the writer of Acts, which most people believe is the same writer of the Gospel of Luke, and we'll just call him Luke for sake of ease this morning. In those speeches, we get the same type of idea. So some of the speeches we find in the book of Acts also contain traces of earlier traditions that point in the same direction. So although we are not going to do them in detail, we're going to just mention them briefly, and I'm going to read them to you briefly. And I would suggest that if this does tickle your fancy, that you go and read them on your own afterwards and just read them plainly for what they say. And you'll see that they kind of point in the same direction. Okay, so the first one is in Acts 13, 32 to 36. The author includes an earlier tradition of the speech by Paul. Okay, quoting, "We preach the good news to you, that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising Jesus. Or as also it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you." So if you read this out and you just write it out maybe, and if you just look at it with a little bit of special attention, Paul is quoting this. This comes from the prophets, of course. Today, you are my son, today I've begotten you. I think it's Psalm 2. He's quoting this portion and he points to the resurrection. So just keep in mind that this is the writer of Acts recalling a saying of Paul, right, or a teaching of Paul. Just keep that in mind. Now, in the author of Acts, it seems that if he is the same person, which we think he is, he's also the writer of Luke. Of course, in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is the Son of God from birth. Like Luke makes it very clear in his birth narrative, which is quite different from Matthew, that the reason why Jesus is the Son of God is because God's Spirit comes like explicitly and overshadows Mary. Like there's an impregnation that takes place then. She's then a virgin by human standards and bears the Son of God, but literally the Son of God, like God comes and impregnates her. So God is literally like the father of Jesus. It's not just a baby that grows in the tummy of a virgin and comes out and he's figuratively a son. He's literally the Son as the Spirit overwhelms the woman. So we know that the Gospel of Luke and therefore also Acts, the view of the actual writer is that Jesus is Son of God, at least we know from birth. But here in his quotation of his memory, which gets a bit hazy, but his memory of Paul's speech, he recalls Paul making this announcement and connecting Psalm 2, today I have begotten you, to the actual resurrection. So this at least is very interesting to us. Jesus is declared, let me make sure I get this. Yet in this speech, Paul reminds his listeners that God's promise to fulfill them is the resurrection, or God's promise to them is fulfilled in the resurrection. Jesus is declared the promised king today at the resurrection. That today becomes the day of the resurrection. That is when God declares that he has begotten Jesus as his son. Thus, pre-literary traditions, in this case, differs from the view of the writer that we've already established. And that's what we see here, and it's also what we're going to be seeing then, of course, in Romans 1, 3 to 4. We find a similar point of view also expressed in Acts 2, verse 36. And here the writer, presumably the same writer as the Gospel of Luke, is quoting Peter, or he's writing down Peter's speech from memory. And he says that the same Jesus who was crucified, God has made him Lord and Christ through the resurrection, and he's sitting at the right hand of God. So once again, we get this, something happens at the resurrection where Jesus goes up in status. In this case, he now is called Lord and Christ. And this happens at the resurrection, and he's elevated to the right hand of the Father. So besides the pre-literary portion in Romans, we also have in Acts at least these two places, and there's actually another one we'll deal with, where it seems like these earlier traditions, these earlier speeches that are remembered, seems to indicate that Jesus was somehow exalted at the resurrection. In other words, he went up in status. Now, of course, that doesn't sit well with the idea that he was the Trinitarian idea, that he was God from the very beginning and equal to God. That seems to be in opposition to the idea that Jesus could be exalted in any way. So anyway, that's what we have. A similar view we also find in Acts 5:30 to 31. Peter is arrested. He's released by an angel and then brought before the high priest for further questioning. And he states then that the God of our fathers raised Jesus. And a little bit further on in the verse, and him God has exalted to his right hand as Prince and Savior. So once again, the resurrection is connected to an exaltation, to the place of Prince and Savior. Here, his resurrection is seen as an exaltation to the right hand of God. So besides Romans 3 to 4, we have also these older speeches that the writer of Acts records for us, and all three of them seem to point that at the resurrection, something really special happens to Jesus. There's an exaltation or an adoption that takes place at this point. So that's three other points in our New Testament that points to this earlier type of view that Jesus kind of could have been exalted at the resurrection. Okay, so this very early Christological view in which God raises Jesus from the dead in order to exalt him as his own divine son and adopt him into the heavenly realm where he sits at the right hand of God to rule and reign with authority of God himself, is called an adoptionist or an exaltation Christology. In other words, in this view, Jesus starts off as a human like all other humans. He is not divine in nature, but he is more righteous. He earns special favor with God through his obedience. And eventually, not loving his life unto death, he goes and he gives his life in obedience, right? That's pretty special. So God responds then by exalting him and adopting him as his divine son, granting him all authority and rule in the heavens. He is adopted then to this divine status. Okay, another data point that points in this direction for us is when we have a look at the Ebionites. Now, the Ebionites were let me just read it from here and make sure I put it out there clearly. Ebionite means the poor, but the Ebionites were a Jewish Christian group that seemed to have been the remnant of this adoptionist view of Jesus' divine sonship. They existed, or we have evidence of them during the 2nd century CE. From those who opposed them, we actually learn about them because their writings weren't copied, and eventually we lost most of it. And so the only evidence we have that they ever existed is from the writings of people that stand against them. And of course, later on, Christianity, the more orthodox views would have stood against this view. This Ebionite idea, or the adoptionist idea, was eventually completely rejected by Christianity, as you very well know. That's why it's sounding as something that's quite strange to you, of course, most of you today. So we learn from those who opposed the Ebionites that they required the followers of Jesus to adopt the Jewish law, right? And also the Jewish customs. And they traced their lineage back to the earliest Jesus followers in Jerusalem under James the Just. So it seems like the Ebionites were basically Jews that said, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. All right, so if you want him, you need to become Jewish because he's the Jewish Messiah. And they would have liked the law. They would have continued with the law probably in its entirety. Even the parts of the law that would make the Jewish religion different from the Greco-Romans around them, like the Sabbath and the eating requirements, etc. Okay, so they traced themselves back to James the Just, which was actually the brother of Jesus. Now we know, and if you're a Christian, you would have heard this, that James was kind of the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And there's a lot of extra biblical things that also point back to the idea that James was actually a very influential person in the very early forms of Christianity. You also would know that James and Paul kind of, even if within our New Testament, if you read their stuff, it's like the ones by faith, the ones are not only by faith, but by works. When James writes, he writes to the 12 tribes of Israel, very Jewish type of writing, where, or at least the book attributed to James in our New Testament, where Paul is the one that basically says, hey guys, look, if you want to become a Christian, especially to the Gentiles, don't worry about the law at all. So we have this idea, and it seems to be quite viable, that there was a group of very early Christians that were known as the Jewish Christians, and they were a portion of them, at least, were called the Ebionites. They traced their authority back to James the Just from Jerusalem. Now, why we are mentioning them is that the Ebionites seem to have a gospel that were very familiar with the Gospel of Luke, it seems, from what we know. But they portrayed John the Baptist, for instance, as a vegetarian, and so they would have a different version of what John did. They wouldn't say he ate locusts. I think their version says he ate bread, because they were strict vegetarians, it seems. But also, something that was very interesting about their gospel is at Jesus' baptism, it says, "Today I have become your father." Now, that's not what we have in our New Testament at the moment. "You are my beloved son" is normally the declaration in Mark and in Luke. But their version was, "Today I've become your father." And so it seems to people that, to the opposition that we learn from, that these were people who actually believed that Jesus was a normal human. But there came a time in his ministry when he became the Son of God. Now, for this particular group of people, it seemed to have been the baptism, right? As Hippocrates, who was a 3rd century theologian, puts it, the Ebionites, quote, assert that our Lord himself was a man in a like sense with all. And so this he says in his Refutation 22. And for Hippocrates, this is an unacceptable view, as for him, of course, and for most Christians today, Christ was already God from before time. Not because he was exalted, but of course because he was pre-existently divine. So it's a later view, ridiculing another earlier view. So a quick side note on the Ebionites, which is rather interesting, is they were then, of course, they were persecuted by the later proto-Orthodox and the Orthodox Christianity that had creeds that affirmed Jesus as God from the very beginning. And so they were persecuted, and they left. They left Palestinian area. Many of them left, and they moved down to Arabia, which to me is incredibly important. Some people estimated that the idea of Jesus that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad from Islam, would have been an Ebionite idea of Jesus. In other words, the idea that he was fully human. Today, of course, the Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet sent by God, special relationship with God, probably righteous, beautiful, and all of that, but still human. And so many theorize that it is actually the Ebionites that were down in Arabia, in the same area where Muhammad grew up, where he would have learned through them who Jesus was. Anyway, that's a little side note. So the adoptionist view was later, of course, superseded by the idea that Jesus was indeed, number one, pre-existingly divine, and that he became human. And so he was human and divine all the way through. And later Trinitarian ideas not only affirmed that, but they also affirmed the ideas that Jesus had always been there and that he had always been divine. But not only that he was equal with God, from the very beginning equal with God, co-equal, co-eternal, made of the same substance, yet a different person. And the final form of the Trinity, of course, then includes the Holy Spirit as the same, co-eternal, co-equal, etc. So the point is this, that the earliest ideas of Jesus might not have been exactly the same as the latest ideas about Jesus. One thing I would like to push out quickly here today, and this is actually for me an incredibly interesting little exercise, and I can't go into detail here, about this, maybe at some later stage, but there was a kind of a progression. Most scholars recognize today that there was a progression in the way that Jesus was understood by the early Christians, or the followers of Jesus that later became known as the Christians, especially in the way they viewed him with regards to his divinity, his sonship, his pre-existence, etc. And that even within our New Testament canon, specifically within the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, we can see this progression. Now, you might never have noticed it. I most certainly did not. But it was only simply because I never read any of them on their own. I never read Mark for what Mark said, Matthew for what Matthew said, Luke for what Luke said, and John for what John said. The culture I grew up in, and I think it's what most evangelical or Protestant Christians really grow up in, is that they all say that we presuppose that they all say the same thing. And so we never ever read any one of them as an individual gospel about Jesus. We never think about the fact that while Mark is writing the Gospel of Mark, or whoever the writer was, there is no Matthew, there is no Luke, there is no John. There's no reference points for his audience. They're getting the Gospel of Mark. That's it. And so we retrospectively read these Gospels already knowing that there will be four. And in many cases, for instance, like in the case of John or Matthew and Luke, they didn't really know about each other while they were writing. Mark most certainly didn't know about the others. So the point is simply that when we go back to the Gospels and we read them for what they say, and we do a study, if we take Mark, for instance, and say, okay, I'm going to stick to Mark today. It might take you more than a day, but I'm going to, from Mark, try and learn who Mark believed Jesus was. And then you do the same for Matthew, and you do the same for Luke, and you do the same for John. That you end up with a view that moves and progresses. All right. Okay. So I'm going to put forward a little bit of information on what this progression might have looked like. Okay, so first thing we need to establish is we're following the four source hypotheses, which says basically Mark is written first, then Matthew and Luke use Mark, and they were written about the same time, about 15 years or so after Mark. And then about 10 years later, John was writing, and John is an independent source, right? That might not have so much bearing on all of this, but that's kind of the platform on which we build. So Mark early, then Matthew, Luke, and then John a little bit later on. Okay, so the progression could have looked something simple or something similar to this. Number one, in the pre-literary sources, in other words, 30 years before Mark writes his gospel, it seems like the earliest followers of Jesus likely believed that he was a normal human being that was exalted to be the Son of God, exalted to be divine at the resurrection, right? Then when we go to Mark, it seems like there's a shift that takes place in Mark. Now, take note of this. Mark does not have a miraculous virgin birth. That's important to see, right? Why doesn't Mark include any of that? Just a passing comment would have been great. Mark didn't know that anybody else was actually going to have Matthew, Luke, and John. Mark is writing a full account of what he believed the gospel should be. But there's no virgin birth. Jesus just arrives where? Where does Mark start? Well, the first line of Mark says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So we know that Mark believed that Jesus was divine. But for Mark, when does Jesus become divine? Well, he doesn't have a pre-existent story. He also doesn't have a virgin birth story. But what he does have is at the baptism. At the baptism, something special happens with Jesus, where the voice comes from the heavens. We're assuming it's God's voice, and making a declaration over Jesus, which seems like only Jesus hears this. And he says, "This is my beloved Son." All right. So it seems like for Mark, by the omission of the virgin birth, by the omission of any pre-existent notions in Mark, that Jesus for Mark becomes the Son of God at his baptism. So we already there have a shift from resurrection. Maybe the thought pattern was something like, he couldn't have been just the Son of God from his resurrection, because what about all the miracles he did? He must have been the Son of God way earlier. Okay, so when did he start doing the miracle? From the baptism. All right, so it seems to be like Mark pins the baptism as the place where this type of an adoption or declaration then at least happens. Okay, so that's in about 70 CE. Now, when we go to Matthew and Luke, it becomes a little bit more conflated. 15 years later, what we have in Matthew and Luke, which a lot of people don't always think about, we have something very special in Matthew and Luke, birth narratives. Both Matthew and Luke have a birth narrative, a miraculous virgin birth narrative of Jesus. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us Jesus doesn't become the Son of God at the resurrection. He doesn't become the Son of God at a baptism. He becomes the Son of God, at least at the birth. God births a son through the Virgin Mary. Okay, so what you will see now is you're seeing we're going backwards. Resurrection, baptism, now at the birth already, Jesus was the Son of God for Matthew and Luke. I've just finished, we're just busy with a study on rediscovering the beauty of the Gospels, and in there, if you're not part of it, we do the comparison between the birth narratives between Matthew and Luke. They are indeed very different, but this is what they have in common. Jesus is birthed miraculously in Bethlehem. That's the thing they communicate to us, and that's the thing they tell us, that he was Son of God or divine even from his birth. Okay, then we get to our very last gospel, which is, maybe I forgot a little bit something here. Oh yeah, there is something I need to mention when it comes to Luke. Now, Luke is a little bit tricky because there are some scholars believe that Luke actually initially did not have the birth narrative, because some of the very earliest manuscripts of Luke has its genealogy. If you've noticed, the genealogy of Luke doesn't sit at the beginning like Matthew, but it sits at the baptism when he's already 30 years old. And then we also have evidence that some of the very earliest manuscripts in Luke actually has the not you are my beloved son, but today I have begotten you. The same way in which the Ebionites believed seem to have been in some of the very early manuscripts in Luke. So there's a theory that Luke initially looked very much like Mark, in fact, but it was later annotated, and they added the birth story to the beginning to show that Jesus was in fact divine from the beginning, born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth. All right, but now we go to the Gospel of John. Now, the Gospel of John is later. So what do we have in the Gospel? How can you trump a God from the beginning, Son of God from birth? Well, John doesn't even bother with a birth story. John starts with the beginning, but not Mark's beginning, not the beginning of the Gospel. John seems to reflect the idea of the beginning of everything. In the beginning was the Word, and he's obviously for John. Jesus is that Word that became flesh. But John trumps the idea that Jesus is Son of God from the resurrection. No. Son of God from baptism? Absolutely not. Son of God from birth? Not even that. Son, God or divine from when? From the beginning of time. And so in John, we see like the next level of how Jesus is viewed as literally with God, divine from the very beginning of time, not just from his birth. So this is a kind of a progression that you see if you take each one of these separate. Of course, what we see in John is not even really the full Trinitarian weight, because Trinity does not just require Jesus to be divine or to be there from the beginning. We know that many Christians who had the Gospels believed that Jesus was divine and there from the beginning, but always believed that he was underneath the Father. They took the Father-Son relationship very seriously, and they said, no, the Son has to be under the Father. Yes, from the beginning, yes, God made everything through him, but he is under the Father. Of course, this is the Arian controversy later, which was declared a heresy, and it's at these creeds, and you'll know the Nicene. What are they called? Sorry, anyway, in the time of Constantine the Great, they called the Nicene, I forgot the English word completely. They brought the bishops together, and at Nicaea, this is what they decided. They decided there by vote, and it was rather overwhelmingly for the idea that Jesus was in fact equal with God, co-equal from the beginning, and that he was the same substance, just in a different person. But that later Trinitarian, and that wasn't the final story yet, right? We still have a later Constantinople meeting where they decide even further things. The point is just John doesn't even reflect the full Trinitarian weight. All of this is said just simply to show that there was a development, and even that development, even within something like our New Testament canon of Scripture, we find that development. We see it there. Scholars have long recognized it, and it's kind of been standard understanding for the last 100 years in the scholarly world. Us Christians, we just very slow to, we don't want to hear it. It's basically the reality. So this is at least a very interesting thought to consider. And it might actually make, and it might actually help you and me when we go back to books of our Bible, we go back to the New Testament Gospels, when we find some differences between them, this progression solves the problem. Because for long, it's been quite obvious to me that Jesus seems very human in Mark, but in John, he's just a different being. I mean, in John, he speaks like a philosopher. He was there from the beginning for John. Where in Mark, Jesus doesn't even get virgin birth. He gets baptized, he does miracles, and a centurion declares him a son of God at the end. The disciples don't even ever get it. It's not the same. It's different. Why? And this is an explanation that really holds a lot of weight, I think, in the academic world. And for me, I've been pretty much convinced by it that this is probably the best explanation for the changes and the differences within the New Testament. It just doesn't make sense to me at all that they all say the same thing. The only reason I believe that I used to believe that is because people told me to believe it. The reasoning doesn't fit very well. Okay, so that's adoptionism or exaltation Christology, that it seems like the very earliest views were in fact this, that Jesus became divine at some point, but was human before that. Okay, so this is why Romans 1:3-4 is such a nugget of gold. It points to a time earlier than Paul. It points to a time where people believed possibly different than what Paul believed, and different to what Mark, Luke, and Matthew believed, and John, and Trinity. It helps us understand the process, and that's where the real value lies. So let's just pop quickly back into and finish off Romans 1:3-4. This pre-literary tradition appears to be one of the more ancient statements of faith that can be found in the literature of the time. And here are some of the reasons why scholars believe that this is the oldest of all the pre-literary, well, at least there's some indication that it's one of the oldest pre-literary tradition. Number one is the emphasis on the human messiahship of Jesus as a descendant of David. We don't even find this in Paul. Paul is our earliest writer of the New Testament canon. Paul never connects Jesus to be the seed of David, right? But these pre-literary traditions, they seem to do that. They give reason to believe that this is the view that was circulating amongst the followers of Jesus, even already during his lifetime. Okay, so Jesus was the one predicted to come to fulfill the messianic prophecies of Scripture. And even after his death, they continued to think of him like this. This was confirmed for them in the resurrection, in spite of Jesus not conquering his Roman enemies, which is kind of the way that the Messiah was expected to do. So this is then the view stressed in the creed as the first of the two important things to say about him. He was son of David according to the flesh. And you also, I mean, obviously the genealogies are also fleshly genealogies, in which, in Matthew at least, connects him to David, and so does Luke. All right. The second reason why we believe this is probably one of the oldest one is a key feature is that the creed stated that Christ was exalted at the resurrection through the Spirit of holiness. Not only does Paul never ever use this phrase again, which is curious, but this is what scholars called a Semitism. Now, Semitism comes from the idea that it comes from the Semitic languages, which in context of when this was more or less written, we've really got two that we're dealing with here. We have Hebrew, and then we would have had I'm not sure if it's called the common version of Hebrew. I know they're very similar, but Aramaic was actually the language that was most probably spoken by Jews in the time of Jesus. But they're both Semitic, so they were quite similar. So what is the Semitism? Well, the Semitism is made up by linking two nouns with the word of in the Hebrew or the Aramaic. So in this case, we have Spirit of Holiness, where we might say Holy Spirit. They used it as Spirit of Holiness. I think it means the same thing, but the fact that it's written like this, to the scholars, the linguists, they believe that this points to the idea that this actually comes from Aramaic or Hebrew origin, which makes this really old. Why? Because Paul writes in Greek. Gospels written in Greek. All the rest of the New Testament written in Greek. So to find stuff within our Gospels that have clear Semitisms, in other words, ways of writing in the Aramaic, is an indication, at least, that this comes from a much earlier time. Okay, so thus it's highly likely that this creed was originally formulated among Aramaic-speaking followers of Jesus in Palestine, and not the later Greek-speaking ones that actually composed the Gospels, so pre-Gospel. So this creed seems to give us some insight into how the earliest followers of Jesus followed him, and how they understood him before and after the resurrection from the dead. They understood Jesus to be designated or appointed to be the Son of God when he was raised from the dead. Paul might have added the in power in this little Romans 1-3 to show that he was in fact exalted higher than before, which seems to be the Pauline view. If we take Paul's writings, the early non-disputed, it seems like Paul believed that Christ was pre-existently divine, but still at the resurrection, he got a higher status than what he had before. But for the original creed, they might have understood Jesus as the Messiah, according to the seed of David, that was appointed as the divine Son of God at the resurrection. This then is an indication of early adoptionist Christology. It would make sense that Paul would quote this ancient creed to the Romans he had never met in order to prepare them for the way for himself to visit them and to be supported by them, to find common ground with them and to assure them that he's of the same belief, right, as they. It was a point of mutual interest for them. God resurrected Jesus, we both believe this, and exalted him to be Lord over all at the right hand of the Father. Paul basically believed all of that, but it's the timing issue that seems to be a little bit different in the pre-literary portion. So this creed then gives us an idea of what belief what belief would have been central. It's a snapshot of shared belief of the very early Christians. It would have been exactly this, that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah in the line of David, but he was declared to be the Son of God according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. Importantly for us Christians today is this. The real positive to come from this, of course, is that the doctrine of resurrection, therefore, doesn't seem to be something that later people invented. So a lot of people that don't believe in the resurrection, they believe that because the Gospels were written so much later, that people later invented the stories about the resurrection. But in fact, the pre-literary sources within Paul's early writings gives us an indication that the idea or the belief that Jesus was in fact resurrected from the dead is a very early one. Like this thing came into being very early. In fact, it's probably the most important understanding about Jesus and one of the earliest, that he was in fact resurrected. All right. Jesus' followers believed that Jesus was raised from the dead. That became the cornerstone of Christianity. That is what propelled Christianity. And as Paul says, without it, we believe in vain. But this also indicates to us that the earliest followers of Jesus might not have understood him to be God in the flesh. Now, this is something we have to struggle with a little bit. At least not in the same way that later proto and later Orthodox Christians and us today seem to have understood the idea. And it once again, it just indicates to us that there was an evolution in the ideas about Jesus. Right, that's Romans 1, verse 3-4. Next week, we move on to our second literary source. This is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 8. And we're going to open that up and see what that gives us. Have an awesome day. See you next week.